Much has been made of the humble Willys MB, better known simply as the Jeep, over the years, as evidenced by easily found and dramatic headlines such as Willys Jeep, how the US Army created the greatest military vehicle of all time from military.com, and why the Jeep was America's greatest contribution to modern warfare on slashgear.com. We've even looked at it ourselves on this very channel, having published a video on it all the way back in August of 2023, so not actually that long ago. But while the Jeep certainly deserves all of that attention, as it really was a truly revolutionary bit of kit, the hype around it does obfuscate some interesting things, like the fact that the Germans had their very own equivalent vehicle, and, well, here it is, the often overlooked and frequently forgotten Volkswagen Type 82 Kubelwagen. Behold! But what of this marginalized machine? When was it built? Why was it built? And was it any good? Well, if those questions happen to be bouncing around your head, don't touch that dial. You're on YouTube, what dial? Because they shall be answered in the next 20-ish minutes. Let's go.
The joys of public Wi-Fi. You're out and about? Yes, no spending on my data plan, except public Wi-Fi is dangerous. Put it away! Unless you've got Surfshark. Unless you've got today's sponsor, Surfshark, which will save you. Surfshark allows you to protect all of your internet activities. One tap and your data is encrypted. So whether you're shopping online, checking your bank account, whatever, you are safe. And if you're traveling, how frustrating it can be to go somewhere new and it's like, oh no, but my Netflix show, why is it not available here? Tell you what, I'm watching a Disney Plus, allegedly. I'm watching a Disney Plus show that's only available in the UK where I don't live. Fire up my Surfshark VPN, boom, pop over to the UK. And the show I'm watching is Boston Legal, by the way. Quick content recommendation within an ad read there. It's a brilliant show. Look, I don't know, what do you want? Netflix in Japan? BBC iPlayer, allegedly, in the US, or where I live, allegedly. Not that I ever use that myself without a television license. That would be wrong. Surfshark is incredibly user-friendly. You don't need to be tech-savvy to use it. Just download, connect, and voila! Your internet is private. Plus, they've got a whole bunch of other stuff like a kill switch, an IP rotator, GPS spoofing on Android, all of that good stuff. Plus, one subscription covers unlimited devices. So why wait? Protect your online life with Surfshark. Use the promo code MEGA for 4 months extra at surfshark.deals/mega. Big thanks to them for sponsoring, and now back to today's video.
The Kubelwagen story begins on the 17th of January 1938, when a consultation took place between Jacob Verlin, the head of the SS Fahrbereitschaft VW, the branch of the SS responsible for liaising with and procuring vehicles from Volkswagen, and Karl Becker, the chief of the Army Weapons Office. The aim of this meeting was simple: to bash out some preliminary ideas for taking the Volkswagen Type 1, which you may know better by its post-war name, the Beetle, and plonking a more utilitarian body on its chassis to adapt it for military use. During this meeting, a basic set of specifications were agreed upon, which stated that the new vehicle must have a 3-man crew, be able to mount a light machine gun, and be no heavier than 950 kilos when fully loaded with all of those things. Aware that this weight goal was in the realm of possibility, but a tad optimistic, they also specified that the body should be made from aluminium, which would be nice and light compared to the good old-fashioned steel. As we would design it, that was a no-brainer, because Verlin and Becker knew just the fella for it. Ferdinand Porsche, for he had originally designed the Type 1, and so he knew better than anyone else what to do. He was given completely free rein to design the new vehicle as he saw fit on the 26th of January, although the Army Weapons Office did request to be regularly updated with schematics and blueprints as and when they were completed, so that they at least had some idea of what he was doing. And since he had been given free rein, Porsche really took his time to get it right. Much to the Army Weapons Officer's chagrin, as they, given that the job amounted to taking an already sorted chassis, plonking a utilitarian body on it, and then bolting some military gubbins on top of that, had expected a nice and quick turnaround. Instead, it would take until the 3rd of November for the first prototype to be delivered for testing. That test would take place 11 days later, and it saw the prototype vehicle, now dubbed the Type 62, which still retained the rear-wheel drive configuration of the Type 1, was pitted against a Hawk 901, which, thanks to its 4-wheel drive and 4-wheel steering arrangement, was the creme de la creme of off-road military cars. We don't know exactly how this test went, as the documentation that recorded it has long since been lost to time, but we do know the result. A big, fat thumbs up from Becker with just one minor gripe to fix: the fact that it was far too pretty and didn't look nearly military enough. With that in mind, Porsche returned to his drawing board, ruler in hand, and set about flattening out all of the Type 62's smooth curves. That took the whole of 5 minutes, and knocking out a few more prototypes in the new shape didn't exactly take much longer, and so come the start of 1939, the ever more finalized vehicle was ready to be put through some intense testing with a view to ironing out any remaining and well-hidden kinks before it was sent for mass production. Now, the story gets a bit patchy again in regards to those tests, but we know that one was taken up to the peaks of the Black Forest to see how it fared in snow, as well as 2 of them being put through a 6-day endurance test in Tyrol, Austria, where they were driven to their limits to see what, if anything, broke under heavy use. These tests were far from a disaster, but equally, they were far from a home run for the Type 62, because when they were completed, the Army Weapons Office presented Porsche with a list of further modifications that he had to make. This time, they were a bit more serious than making it look a bit meaner, and included things like messing about with a normal Type 1 gearbox to increase torque output at the cost of top speed, giving it a further 50mm of ground clearance, things like that. Not minor changes for sure, but by no means damning orders to fundamentally redesign the whole thing. This took until December of 1939, with the first 2 completed units of what was now called the Type 82 being delivered to the Army Weapons Office that same month. They were dead chuffed by that point, and so full production began in February 1940. Alright, so now that we know about the how of the Type 82 coming about, let's bring this chapter to a close and zoom in on what it actually was, beyond the surface level details that we've just mentioned. All in all, the Kubelwagen proved to be quite a handy bit of kit. A standard Type 82 was 3.74 meters in length, 1.6 in width, and 1.65 in height, which for a point of reference makes it not far off the same dimensions as the Willys Jeep, which was near as damn it the same width and height, but the Jeep was nearly a full 30 centimeters shorter than the Kubel. This slight difference in length might seem immaterial at first, but it actually, in practical terms, made quite a bit of difference on how they could be used, as it allowed the Kubelwagen to have 4 proper doors, and thus be able to carry 4 people far easier than the Jeep could, whose back passengers instead had to awkwardly scramble either over the sides or climb over the front seats to get in. Not the end of the world, to be sure, but certainly not the most ergonomic design, is it? Now, normally, one could argue that this was in fact a hidden advantage for the Jeep, as a shorter ground clearance means that it's less likely to bottom out, thanks to this affording a higher breakover angle, the maximum angle at which a vehicle can pass over a crest or ramp without the underside of the vehicle touching the ground. But alas, no, because thanks to the Kubelwagen having a ground clearance of 28 centimeters compared to the Jeep's 22 centimeters, the advantage of having a shorter wheelbase was completely nullified. We actually did the maths on this ourselves and figured out that with the Kubelwagen having a wheelbase of 2.4 meters compared to the Jeep's 1.9 meters, it can make it over a 26.2 degree ridge before bottoming out compared to the 25.9 degrees for the Jeep. The Kubelwagen is also markedly lighter than the Jeep, with a standard unloaded Type 82 coming in at a mere 750 kilos compared to 1,060 for the Jeep. That is a solid victory for the Kubelwagen, and there's no two ways about it. Lighter is better for an off-roader, as it means a vehicle will exert less ground pressure and thus be less likely to sink into soft surfaces, and is easier to manhandle out when it does get stuck. When it comes to power, however, the tables turn completely, as the Jeep blows the Kubelwagen out of the water with a whopping 60 horsepower compared to a mere 23 in the standard Type 82. This meant that a Jeep could top out at 105 km per hour compared to 80 km per hour for the Kubelwagen, and this is despite the Jeep being much heavier. Further to just straight line speed, however, the extra power of the Jeep also affords it an advantage in towing, with it being rated to pull a maximum of 907 kilos compared to 450 for the Kubel, and that's just with the Kubels that actually had a tow hook fitted, as it was not even a standardized feature. So then, with there being no clear winner between them, that makes answering the question that we've been clearly building towards in this chapter, which is which one is better, all the harder to answer. The Jeep, for example, is better in a straight line and much better at towing, whereas it would appear that the Kubel is handier off-road despite lacking four-wheel drive, a takeaway that, while very much grounded in objective metrics that we can actually compare in a format such as this, also more or less matches the author of today's piece who's actually driven them both's experience. Although he does note that he's done this within the sanitary confines of military vehicle shows, not exactly knee-deep in the frozen mud of the Battle of the Bulge, but still, he reckons they match. But such a question at all may in fact be moot. We chose to frame this chapter in the way we did, partly because using a more familiar vehicle as a frame of reference allows you, the audience, to better get your head around what it is we are discussing. But also because contemporary discourse around the Kubelwagen is that it is not a specific vehicle that was made under unique conditions and to address very particular needs. No, it was a Nazi Jeep, as evidenced by articles such as Meet the Kubelwagen, Nazi Germany's very own military Jeep, and this was Nazi Germany's answer to the Jeep, as found in the National Interest and We Are the Mighty respectively. But in reality, they were built to satisfy different military needs, with the Jeep actually being a very light truck, i.e. a vehicle designed to move stuff, and the Kubelwagen being a light passenger vehicle, i.e. a vehicle meant to move people. Naturally, with war being quite the chaotic affair, they both strayed into each other's roles to a certain degree, but nonetheless, to compare the Jeep with the Kubelwagen is to compare an apple to an orange. I mean, yes, they are both fruit, they are both about the same size, and they are both tasty, but at the end of the day, they're really quite different. And so, they shouldn't really be compared. Okay, now we are very possibly about to set a record for the shortest chapter ever featured in a Mega Projects video, because while the history around the Kubelwagen and its technical design are indeed rather interesting, if we do say so ourselves, it was ultimately just a car. And so, while it no doubt did have a huge impact on the war, its impact wasn't exactly what you would find exciting, certainly not in the way, say, a tank's service record would be. You know, tanks have big old cannons and they go fighting and stuff like that. And so we could spend 900 words or so reeling off an endless list of various famous bums that plonked themselves down on its seats over the years, as well as all the weird little exceptions that saw it doing other things, or we could just sum it up with the following. It went everywhere the German army went during the war, with some prototypes even seeing service in Poland, and throughout all of that, its mainstay role was as a personnel carrier, but it also found itself pushed into other roles such as battlefield ambulance, a commander's car, a radio car, and a very light artillery tractor, basically any role that could be filled by a small car, because it was a small car. Beyond that, it was also one of the most produced German vehicles of the war, with a grand total of 50,435 of them having left the factory come the end of hostilities in Europe, a figure which, as far as we can tell, was only broken by the Opel Blitz truck, of which it appears that over 100,000 were produced, with the sources varying a bit on the exact number. And that's it, we're done. End of chapter, let's move on. A lot of different varieties of the Kubelwagen were churned out during its 5-ish years in production, and a lot of these are quite dull. A few variants, however, were legitimately big departures from the Type 88 norm, and, well, they're worth us having a quick look at. The first one of interest appeared before the Type 82 even entered mass production in February 1940, as in 1939, Porsche designed a 4-wheel drive chassis that was able to take both the civilian VW Beetle body, which was dubbed the Type 87, and the military Kubelwagen body, which was named the Type 86. For both of these types, Porsche also rebored the standard engine, stretching it out to a displacement of 1.1 liters, and as a result, pushing its output up to an absolutely phenomenal 25 horsepower. Although these certainly represented a big leap in capabilities for the nascent design, both were met with initial apathy. The Type 82, despite lacking 4-wheel drive and having a more modest engine, appeared as though it was going to be perfectly adequate, so why mess about and delay the start of mass production as war loomed? Eventually, however, this apathy would dissipate, with the Type 87 entering full production in 1941, with a total of 564 units being produced. A good portion of these would end up being sent across the Mediterranean to the Africa Corps, having been first beefed up with meteor filters to protect their carburetors and air intakes from the harsh North African sand. As for the Type 86, it was never adopted exactly as Porsche designed it, with a grand total of 6 prototypes being the only units ever produced, but its chassis and drivetrain would eventually go on to form the basis of the Type 166 Schwimmenwagen, which, as the name suggests, was fully aquatic. It entered mass production in 1942, and by the time production ended 2 years later, 15,584 of them had been built, making it the most produced aquatic vehicle in history. Beyond just those two, however, another particularly interesting variant was the Type 155, a half-track model. It was designed as a response to the Type 82's performance both in the sands of North Africa and the snow of the Soviet Union, where, despite all the efforts made to engineer it as a cheap and cheerful utilitarian off-road vehicle, it was still struggling here and there. In Africa, for example, it was found that particularly steep and soft sand dunes simply couldn't be climbed, and in the Soviet Union, as any all-wheeled vehicle did in fairness, when the mud got really bad, it just got completely bogged down and stuck. A half-track was the obvious solution to these problems, as tracks offer far superior traction thanks to them having a larger surface area in contact with the ground as compared to wheels, and they also reduced ground pressure by spreading the weight of the vehicle across a greater area. Unfortunately, however, despite these very real advantages, it was not meant to be for the Type 155. Prototyping work began in late 1942, which saw it tested alongside Multier half-tracks, which, thanks to them being very well known as a quality off-roader, were to act as a benchmark for the 155 to meet. It put in a decent showing, too, easily able to keep up with the Multier, but unfortunately, this performance came at too high a price as the extra weight of the track system reduced the maximum road speed down to a mere 5 miles per hour, and the fuel economy down to 94 liters per 100 kilometers, which, for reference, made the 155 about as thirsty as a Tiger 1 tank. And that just wasn't very good at all, so the project was abandoned. Then there was the Type 157, a variant capable of traveling on railway tracks thanks to having a set of flange steel inserts fitted behind the normal wheels and having its axles extended out to the width of the tracks. Unfortunately, beyond that, we couldn't find too much information about this one, as all the sources we consulted featured barely a paragraph dedicated to it, so this is nothing if not a shame, because this is certainly a pretty peculiar iteration. The most peculiar variant of all, though, was probably this, the Type 82/3, which, as you can no doubt tell by the picture here, was a Type 82 that was rigged up to look like a dummy tank. For many years, this was an enigma, a variant that, much like the 157, was just something that existed at some point. And hell, if we knew much specific about it. We knew that they were used both for tank crew training and as dummies to fool enemy reconnaissance efforts, and, well, that's kinda it. Fortunately, however, one turned up on eBay, of all places, in 2016, which revealed that the modifications were actually rather extensive, and not just a load of tank-esque bits plonked on top of a Type 82, as you might initially imagine. Instead, the tank body is a specifically constructed bit of kit that was plonked on top of a bare chassis, and said body also had a dedicated swiveling commander's chair and a turret rotatable via a hand crank. As for its history, we got absolutely no idea. Oh, and if you happen to be wondering, it ended up selling for $28,000. Initial production of the Kubelwagen naturally came to a halt following the surrender of Germany, but that is far from the end of its story, because what if we were to tell you that actually not only did production of it continue after the war, but that it is in fact the only reason that Volkswagen as we know it exists today? Sounds pretty far-fetched, doesn't it? But it's completely true. As for exactly how, well, it all comes down to the efforts of Major Ivan Hurst of the British Army. He was sent to secure the ruins of the Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg in August of 1945, both from civilian looters and from other Allied armies who might try to claim the factory, or at least strip it bare. When there, he found that what he'd been told was a ruin was actually in pretty good nick, all things considered. Sure, the odd building had been leveled, a few roofs had caved in, and there was still a few unexploded bombs lying about the place, but all in all, the facility was far from a write-off. And even better still, the machinery, the most expensive part of any factory, was largely still functional, having been saved from the bombing by being relocated to a remote and outlying location around the factory. And so he arranged to have it all brought back to Wolfsburg and have the factory brought online again, reasoning that restarting production there would both help kickstart the local economy and alleviate British vehicle shortages in occupied Germany. The British government agreed and duly placed an order for 20,000 Type 82s. Only 2,490 of this order would ever be delivered, but it mattered not. Volkswagen, which, like so many other Nazi-founded companies, could easily have been pulled apart for profitable salvage and forgotten about, but it was back up and running, albeit now as a British state enterprise. The cash gained from selling these post-war Type 82s gave Volkswagen the resources it needed to fund full production of the Type 1 Beetle, which come 1949, when Volkswagen was handed back to the German state, was steadily being pumped out of the factory by the tens of thousands per year, and from there the rest was history. Volkswagen would become one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world, and it was all thanks to the Kubelwagen.